talking about cognitive paleo. I have no idea what this is.
Well, hopefully you know by the end of it, but maybe you'll say, well, I have no idea what this is. Anyway, thanks a lot for organizing the visit, and I've had a great time today talking to various faculty, so it's been really fun. Merced used to be just a place where I'd fly by going between LA and the Bay Area. So it's nice to actually stop and look around. Yeah, cognitive paleoethology, which is a made-up term, but I'm going to tell you why we made it up, and the origins of human expertise. And what I'm going to do is tell you a bit about a project that actually started at Indiana University and involves, first technical difficulty, here we go, involves 4 other collaborators with myself, Kathy Schick and Nick Todd, who are anthropologists, and they also run the Stone Age Institute, which is a separate institute just north of Bloomington, Indiana. That's their wonderful library. They are specialists in stone tool manufacture from ancient Paleolithic times. Tom Sherman, who's an anthropologist who works on neuroscience. I'll say a bit more about everybody in a moment. Peter Todd, who you had here recently, and myself, and money from the John Templeton Foundation for what's essentially an anthropological project. The project goals were to try to identify some likely drivers of brain expansion in hominins, and I'll tell you what that term means more explicitly in a moment, especially in a period, broadly 3.5 to 1.5 million years ago, a little bit more focused, maybe 2.5 to 1.5 I'll focus on in this talk. And this era is something that's absolutely fascinating for reasons I'm going to try and convey, but also the data are sparse in some respects, but not in others, and the theories are somewhat speculative. So part of the question is, can we find ways to use all this to develop an epistemology of early hominin cognition, which I mean ambiguously, right? What do they know, and what do we know about what they know? And pull in evidence from all these diverse sources, and I'm going to try and give you a flavor of some of that as we go along here. So the main, the 5 of us who are the main people, Nick and Kathy, have been doing archaeological excavations, particularly in Africa, but really all over the world over the course of their career. And you'll see some of this later, but some of you may have seen them on television teaching kanzi, the bonobo, to make stone tools. And Tom Sherman is an associate prof at Indiana, might be another good candidate for your speaker series here. And I'll tell you a bit about his work, but he's particularly interested in the evolution of communication and language and its relationship to brain expansion. Peter Todd, I don't think I need to say much about in this room, but particularly for this project, we're very interested in sort of what the evolved systems are for search. And I originally was going to do something with animals, but the John Templeton Foundation back then did not fund animal research at all. And so my role got reduced to that of gadfly, basically trying to annoy everybody else. But I picked a topic that allows me to still talk about animals. So there's going to be a lot of animals in this talk. And in particular, expertise and recognition of expertise as an evolutionary and cultural driver. But we can't say much about culture in this era at all. I had suggested, if anybody was going to do any background reading, a couple of chapters from this book of Steralny, The Evolved Apprentice, How Evolution Made Humans Unique. So much of this, I like what he does in this book, but so much of this literature is focused on human uniqueness. And we're looking at a period where we probably can't say 2 million years ago that these creatures were particularly unique, but there's something very interesting happening cognitively, and I would rather understand all those threads of development, similarities and differences, rather than just sort of try to come up with a grand theory of why we're special. I put up this review of the book by Tim Lewins because it reminds me to make some interesting points, which is that what Steralny is doing here, Lewins says, is offering a plausible narrative account of how we came to have the characteristics that we have. Lewin says it's not offered with great certainty, but at the same time it's far more than mere how, possibly explanatory sketch. Something more like a quite probably actually narrative. So that's sort of what we're aiming for. And he says it is philosophical, partly because it's speculative, partly because it's an armchair activity that's parasitic on the empirical work of others. So philosophers and parasites, here we are. But it also involves the kind of conceptual ground clearing loved by philosophers, Lewin says, and I think appreciated by scientists who are also trying to sort out these things. So aside from some other differences where Sterelny naturally tends to focus on much later parts of the story, we're focusing on this rather early part of the story. There are a lot of things I like about the way Sterelny approaches this, which is that it's very phylogenetic, right? We're thinking about comparisons across different closely related species, Neanderthals for one of them, right? He, like me, is very much against single factor explanations, right? We didn't get to be unique because we invented fire. No, right? You know, that's one part of a huge complex of factors that are all interacting in complex ways that we still don't really know how to describe well. I also like his non-nativism, that is, the simple evolutionary stories that say, and then a mutation had happened and we got language, right? Just don't interest me. I think they're most likely wrong. We're looking at a very complex multifactorial process, and anti-individualist in the sense that he thinks it has a lot of what's going on in this is changing in the social conditions that enable the kinds of learning from each other and hence the evolved apprentice. And some of what I have to say about expertise will feed into that today. So the goals today then are to tell you a bit more about the kind of evidence we've been looking at, and tell you a little bit more about what I mean by the Pleistocene, which is this period I've been talking about. All these geologic eras are very vague boundaries. You can't say it ends here, it starts there. And what we mean by hominin, I've got another slide about that in a moment, but basically it's all the ancestors, all the branch of the evolutionary tree since the divergence from the Pan genus, chimpanzees and bonobos. And then to tell you something about sort of a framework for thinking about the inferences that are being made about these organisms in this time period. And we're calling this cognitive paleoethology as an extension of something that already exists, which is paleoethology. And I'll tell you more about what that is. And if I've got time at the end, I will, I'll tell you how this applies to expertise, and I'll tell you a little bit how I think this relates to philosophy of cognitive science. All right, so just a quick introduction here to your family tree. So the last common ancestor with chimpanzees is somewhere 6 to 7 million years ago. That's the point A. I stole this chart from Nature. And around about 2 or 3 million years ago, common chimpanzees and bonobos, previously known as pygmy chimpanzees, also split. That's thought to have happened because of a shift in the Congo River. There's a lot of interesting things to say about that. And on the right-hand side, then, we have these semi-erect and erect apes, right, that are already beginning to make stone tools more than 3 million years ago. And around about somewhere in this period, we get the first emergence of upright walking, hands-free, non-tree dwelling individuals that we now start putting into the Homo genus. And we'll say also there's a huge amount of controversy about how many species there are, how they all relate to one another. Some of the people I'm interacting with are much more inclined to be lumpers rather than splitters about this, because some of the features that have been taken in the past to indicate species differences we now know are well within the range of differences within species. And I'll say a little bit more about one of those cases as we go along here. And as part of this project, I've been extremely fortunate to go to these 3 sites. In Tanzania, the Olduvai Gorge, and our collaborator there is actually another IU faculty member, Jackson Zhao, to the Dmanisi site in the Republic of Georgia. And that's a fabulous site where they've discovered 5 hominins in a very small area, less than the size of this room, that all pretty much are contemporaneous within what counts as contemporaneous in this field. And this is one of the prime places for arguing that these are actually the same species, even though there's a huge range in their cranial capacities. And then the Nihuan Basin in China, so we have collaborators in both of those, and actually we were all in Bloomington Friday and Saturday, so everybody mentioned so far we were having a big workshop about the latest of this. Now it turns out that they think they've got a site, not Nihuan, but closer to Xi'an, which is more like down here, that maybe 2.1 million years ago, right? So the sort of looks like, well, they've got 100,000 years to get from here to there, but actually the radiation might have happened even sooner than that. So just because Dmanisi is the oldest known site outside Africa for these hominins, you shouldn't assume that there weren't others out there before. Another slide I stole this one from a project at Stony Brook University that I'm using it, modified it slightly. So the Olduvai site is in Tanzania, just south of Kenya here, where that star is, and I put that star there. The Lamekwi site is in northern Kenya, so Ethiopia is next above, the blue seas from up there. They've discovered mapped tools at this site, so tools that they're pretty sure were manufactured by bashing rocks together from 3.3 million years ago, and that's the oldest sort of roughly accepted date for these things. But they're quite crude, and I'll talk about that more. The dashed lines here indicate where the evidence is sparse, but then you start finding a lot more of this kind of very crude tool, including at Olduvai around 2.2 million years ago. And then you start finding other forms of tool appearing that are being worked a bit more intensively. And then around about 1.76 million years ago, you get these much larger and more elaborately worked tools appearing. So that's something of the progression here. Here's a screenshot of a bunch of Lamekwian tools, the oldest form from that particular site I showed you. So this is 10 centimeters, so actually on the screen it's fairly close to actual size. So you can see these are pretty chunky pieces of rock, right? They're very likely worked. They might have knocked a couple of flakes off them. They probably used the flakes. They may or may not. Nobody really knows. Were they using what's left behind after you've knocked the flake off, or were you just using the flake? We don't really know. Once you get to the older one, though, you start finding a lot more different forms. You find things they're definitely using as flakes. They're also working the cores multiple times for multiple flakes, but they're also working the cores into shapes that can be used to articulate the joints of animals that they're probably eating at that time. And you start finding cut marks on bones and this kind of thing. Right? So one of the things that Jackson and Zhao, who I mentioned at Olduvai, has been working on is can he disambiguate marks left by crocodiles from marks left by stone tools? And the answer is you can, but you have to look very closely. You also find these spheroid things. Nick and Kathy's view of that is that these are actually things that they're using as hammers, and as you repeatedly use as a hammer, they take on this round, and they've shown experimentally that they'll take on this spherical shape within a matter of hours of being used repetitively with the kind of material that they have there. And again, the size, so that's 5 centimeters, so now that's like more than double life size. So you see they're also working at a finer grain level here, and you can see that in this picture here too, on the transition from all to one, right? So these things are quite a bit smaller than a human hand size. These are Acheulean tools, which are more elaborate, and I'm going to have less to say. Oh, well, I have something to say about them as we go along, but they come at the end of the period we're talking about, and some of these are, quite large. I mean, that hand again is roughly life size here, so you can see these are fairly chunky pieces. Full disclosure, these are modern replicas of Olduvai and Acheulean technology by, I think this is actually, it's either Nick Toth's hand or it's one of his grad students, I forget which, right? But replicating the form. So we've got science changes going on, we've got form changes going on, and we've got questions about what else is going on. So if we jump to the kind of work that Tom Sherman has been doing, so this is a plot from him. where every plot on this, every dot on this represents an actual fossil specimen and an estimate of the interior cranial capacity of that specimen. And we're going back here 35 million years just to show that, so you've basically just got monkeys back here. You start seeing apes, and you get to here 3 million years ago, and something quite dramatic has happened, right? There's a sudden acceleration in the size of things that we're finding. These bars here give you range for, these are extant great apes, so the orange is actually gorilla, the red is actually chimpanzees, so you get a sense of how this fits within the range of modern apes. And this is modern human right here, okay? So we still find modern humans with cranial capacities that are actually in line with, well, these are all pigs, some of the very most archaic Homo forms, right? So again, speaking to that huge range of within a species. So when you find something that's twice as big as something else in the same species, and then you find that archaeologically, you probably shouldn't discount the possibility that you're actually looking at the same species. You're just looking at variation within that. And so there's that inflection point. Some people have claimed that they see an inflection point here. It's a little hard to see whether you see anything like an inflection point there. But one other interesting thing I'll point out, this is more just trivia than anything else, but Neanderthals are these red squares. The green circles are fossilized Homo sapiens. So the biggest known Neanderthal fossil is actually bigger than the biggest known fossilized Homo skull, right? So we shouldn't necessarily be so proud of the fact that we got the biggest brains, but you might be thinking, well, what about encephalization quotient? We got big brains for the size of our body, and the Neanderthals were just bigger, right? And some of that is going on. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And this one's just to sort of, again, give you a landmark of where those tool forms sort of come in. So you've got creatures whose brains are not much bigger than current chimpanzees, this bar, producing all these forms of tools, and even around here, the range that you've got is still pushing down into current chimpanzees, right? And that's actually a later, more elaborated form. The ones I showed you before are a little bit more accurate rendition of what you see here. These come, when they get that nice, we're basically about 1 million years ago, right? Okay, so how do we make sense of all of this? So this term cognitive paleoethology is sort of deliberately designed where cognitive ethology meets paleoethology. What's that? Well, many of you will know ethology as the evolutionary study of animal behavior. Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen won a Nobel Prize for essentially developing this science. And Tinbergen famously said any full explanation, full understanding of animal behavior is going to have to address 4 questions. What's the mechanism? What's its function, meaning what's it good for? What's the phylogeny? How did it evolve? And what's the development? How does the ontogeny of it? And more recently, the term cognitive ethology got invented, and I had a little bit to do with some of the pushing of that. Originally, that was invented by Donald Griffin to say ethologists need to pay attention to consciousness. We can talk about consciousness another time, but in general, it's brought a whole lot more thinking about cognition into the study of animal behavior from an evolutionary perspective. And so things like the cognitive animal and species of mind, nature's purposes, these are all our attempts early on to try to work out some of this, getting away from the narrow consciousness question. And I think of this as what I say 4C, not 4 plus C. What do I mean by that? Well, Gordon Burkhart, my co-editor on this volume here, thinks that consciousness should have been a 5th aim for ethology. He has a paper called The 5th Aim for Ethology. I rather think that consciousness and cognition need to be overlaid on all of these, right? What are the mechanisms? What are the functions? What's the phylogeny? What's the ontogeny? So that's just to sort of orient you to the way I think about that. Paleoethology is a term of art that comes about in various places, but particularly in this paper by Hone and Fox fairly recently in the Journal of Zoology. where they're actually thinking about how you learn about behavior from the fossil record for everything going back dinosaurs and before, right? So they're not thinking about it specifically in the anthropological context. And they developed this list of 11 things to think about. They're really heuristics in a strong sense. They're not decision procedures. But some of it's just good science. Be specific about your hypothesis and which taxon you're talking about. Be specific about your terminology. These are, like I say, just good science. But remember, the behavior is extraordinarily plastic, right? So organisms, even ones with much smaller brains, change behavior in all sorts of different contexts, right? So you have to bear that in mind when you're trying to make inferences about the capacities of these organisms. Functional morphology provides evidence, and that's also something very much worth thinking about in the anthropological context. So it looks like some of those individuals who are at Dmanisi had arms like this, not like this, right? They had much more rigid wrists. Their legs were kind of anatomically modern, but their arms were not. And that might be because they've still got adaptations for actually clambering through branches. It's some suggestion that they may have been sleeping in the trees at night for protection from predators and so on, right? So that's all part of the evidence base. Comparing to extant taxa, living organisms, I'll say more about that. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but being aware of rare behaviors and where your fossils come from and all the rest of it, these are all important things. And when we bring it in the cognitive domain, I want to say, obviously, we want to be specific about cognitive terminology, and we want to remember that cognition makes the behavior even more extraordinarily plastic, right? So the ability to plan and do other kinds of cognitive tasks and better memory access and all the rest of it, open up spaces for all kinds of new behavior. And just to reiterate this point about functional morphology, providing evidence, and then the cognitive comparison, and searching for additional lines of evidence, which was the last one on their list, is something we'll do here. And then this little animation is just, for those of you know, the Baldwin effect is, as originally formulated, discounted, but actually I think in telling the kind of story that Sterelny and I want to tell, these kinds of feedbacks where changes of behavior in the lifetime of organisms actually change the niche, which is then doing the selection, right, have to be considered as an important part of the process. So it's not just some magic genetic change. There's this co-evolution of the behavior and the niche and the organism. So in the spirit of specificity about cognitive terminology, I decided to focus on expertise, as I said. And if you go to a dictionary, which philosophers are told never to do, you'll see this definition, for example. This actually comes from one dictionary: expert, skill, or knowledge in a particular field. Well, you think, well, lots of animals are experts. These monkeys these red howler monkeys are expert tree climbers, aren't they, right? But I want to claim that they're experts without expertise. What do I mean by that? Well, they're all within some reasonable distribution, roughly equally good at clambering through trees. They don't last very long if they aren't, right? There's strong selection pressure on this. And so you get something that, if you or I were to go through trees like they do, we would be expert branch runners, right? But for them, it's just the normal species characteristic. I also want to point out that in this definition, though, there's a sort of embodied skill part and a cognitive knowledge part, and that will come up later. But what I want to say about expertise, then, is it's not just high skill or knowledge in a species, but different specializations by members of different members of the same species. So something like knowledge in a particular field, which was in that original definition, but really stressed that particularity, right? That particularity within the species. Why is it important? Well, it promotes learning from experts. If you've got differential skills, you can learn from those. It leads to division of labor, and eventually to the kinds of division of labor that can get you these big structures that humans are able to put together. So what can we say about expertise that we might see in the stone tool record. So this is a figure that's gone through a couple of hands in the anthropological field, people studying these kinds of periods of tool development. And this is just a sketch, but the idea is that when you look at the Aldebaran tools, there's a few different forms. There's actually more than two, so this is already a caricature, right? By the time you get to the Acheulean, where they're making those symmetric axes, right, you've got several other forms, and some of them may have subdivided. By the time you get to the Mysterian later, you've got even more things going on. And the Upper Paleolithic, you've got arrowheads of everything else, all right? So you get this diversification of forms, and it's natural to think that maybe not every individual is equally good at the production of all those forms, right? To do the fine work to produce a small arrowhead might take a rather different skill set than from being able to produce a cleaver, right, or a big axe. So you might think there's some evidence of this, but it's all very circumstantial. Also, then, going along with the idea that this kind of expertise, if it exists, and the kind of recognition of expertise, the kind of learning that goes on in learning differentially from experts, might be supported by the availability of those different experts. That's something that depends on individuals being able to recognize differences in expertise. We want to ask, well, what allows us, current, right, but what might have allowed earlier forms, this is our comparative approach, to recognize that. And so I've sort of thought through 5 main categories of markers of expertise. So one is you can look at the artifacts themselves and say, oh, that's really well made, right? An expert must have made that. That's sort of one kind of approach you can take. You can also perhaps observe the speed, efficiency, and reduction of waste by the producers. So on the first one, as we look through the lithic record, right, we're finding more and more forms. There's clearly improved skill. If it's expertise in my sense, we also would like to find evidence that it's different individuals perhaps doing this. And one way we might do it is if, as sometimes happens in these assemblages that the archaeologists find, you can refit the pieces. You have all the stuff they knocked off. You might be able to reconstruct the actual process for a given tool. Now, the actual availability of that for the time period I'm talking about is really, really non-existent 2 million years ago. There are some much more recent, like 300,000 year ago examples of that. But you can tell something about the skill of the process just by looking at how efficiently it was done. Even if you don't have the tool, by the way. So there are cases from the UK in Boxgrove where they have all of the debitage, the stuff that came off the side, but they don't have the actual tool. But they have enough of the debitage that they can actually reconstruct pretty well what the actual tool would look like. There are use markers. So what are these things being used for, and also are they effectively used? So you might not see the person who made a particular tool, but when you see somebody using it versus a tool made by somebody else, then you might say, oh, that tool's really effective, that's a good tool. Social markers, this apprenticeship, association with prestige individuals, this of course, the evidence of this is going to come much, much later. And then the communicative and linguistic markers, can you effectively communicate about the task, being one marker of expertise, also coming much later. So how much of this can we take and apply in the cognitive paleoarchaeological context? So could we come up with ways to leverage the archaeological record to identify specialization or expertise? I've talked about contemporaneous possibility of, well, maybe I didn't mention this, so sorry. But within a particular site, maybe you can find from these assemblages some tools that are more roughly made and some that are better made. And maybe then you can make some inferences about the distribution of the population, or maybe it's age stratified, maybe it's learners and non-learners. However, we can actually do better than throw up our hands at that point, because it turns out that some of these assemblages, particularly the one at Aldevai that I was talking about earlier, are in locations which are actually very high predation risk for the individuals making and using those tools there. It looks like they were living several miles away, up high, surveying the scene. You know, oh, there's a dead elephant, or there, you know, those hyenas have just killed a buffalo, right? So aggressive scavenging is one of the hypotheses here about how this gets started rather than hunting. And so they trek down, might be a 30-minute walk, right? Scare away the other predators, and then go to work on the carcass. You're not going to take the kids on a trip like that, right? These are not training sites, these are use sites. But you've got, because it requires cooperation and collaboration among the individuals to keep the other predators away, right? Then you might also have a range of differential roles and perhaps differential skills in the production and use of the tools there. You can also tell in some cases, again, the evidence is not as much as we would like, but you can tell in some cases whether the scrape marks on the bones are being done by individuals who know what they're doing and individuals who don't. So if you give this task to undergraduates, as some people have done, where, you know, here's a limb of a sheep or something, and here's a stone tool, we'll get the meat off it, you find that the people who don't know what they're doing make cuts along the length of the bone instead of across the bone, as you should be doing, right? So these kinds of markers might be there. Not to say that we haven't at this point. The individual refits I've already talked about. So if we could get enough of it to put it together, we could actually say something about the actual sequence in which these tools were produced. And here I've cheated a little bit because this is a pile of rocks from a much more recent site that's about 700,000 years old, also from that Atlantean area near Sienne that I mentioned. This is room 2, parent room, so you can see all the tools on the shelves here. There's another room with equally many tools all spread around that room on all 4 sides. This pile of rubble here, every single rock in that pile has been individually numbered. It is the byproduct of tool making, all right? So are the data sparse? Well, nobody's actually gone through and tried to refit all of that stuff, right? But you know, it suggests that what ought to happen here is some massive 3D scanning project and then do some computer analysis over it to try to figure out whether we have enough of the kind of evidence that we'd like to get here. Handedness is an interesting thing. So chimpanzees have hand preferences, but they're about a 50-50 split in the population. Modern humans are 90% right-handed, all right? There's all sorts of questions about what it means to be handed and how you measure it and all the rest of it. But could you in the debitage find evidence, because you know from the angle at which something was hit, whether, you know, which hand was holding the piece that was being struck and which hand was holding the handle, right? So perhaps perhaps there's more evidence there. Turns out that that's a very hard problem for people to sort out, because this is work by Lana Ruck, one of the grad students on our project. It turns out there's not good inter-subject agreement on the handedness ratings of experimentally produced rocks, and that's a big problem because people have been publishing results in other places on the basis of that. But yes, perhaps with more computational analysis, more machine learning, rather than relying on human judgment about this, it would be possible to make some progress there. And I've already mentioned the markers of cuts. What about leveraging comparative methods? So animal tool making and animal recognition of expertise, and then human and animal cognitive neuropsychology of tool making and expertise. So on the left, you've already seen the Lemekwi findings, or some sample of Lemekwi findings. I forgot to say that these are actually just 4 different angles on the same item, right? These are 3 different angles here. Those are only 10 years old, and they were produced by a bonobo. All right, so if you want to compare what a bonobo is capable of, you've got the possibility of taking some objective measurements on these things and perhaps saying, you know, the bonobo is capable of something that was happening 3 million years ago, but maybe not anything more recent than that. So this is Nick teaching conceit to make stone tools, and there's some video here. I'm probably not going to have time to run it all together, but I do want to point out that point I made previously. You'll notice that conceit has very little wrist flexibility, right? We can do all this wrist flicking stuff, which actually might be also evolved to facilitate fast throwing, because you get a bullwhip type phenomenon where you're increasing the energy concentration as you go down the limb, right? But yeah, what you can do with your stiff wrist and the degree of control, fine control you have, really limits the kinds of things you can do. And so if that's what we're looking at 1.75 million years ago, we have to take into account the level of skill that we see in the tools based on what we know about the anatomy. Kanzi's going to take this and cut a piece of rope and get a treat out of it. And here it's showing that the two things don't have to be right on top of each other. He's got plenty of planning capacity to say, oh, I've got to make the tool here and go over there. And many of you may know that there are other animals that do this. An interesting example is the New Caledonian Crow. I'm not going to sort of be able to go into this in much detail, but they use a variety of natural objects. This reminds me, though, to say that we're looking at stone tools because we have stone tools, but chimpanzees use also all kinds of stuff that is not going to get preserved, right? So they stick sticks into termite mounds, they chew on sticks to pick them up faster once they're coming out of the termite mound, right? So there's modification. We see this in the crows as well. But one thing to say about the ripping of the leaves that you see in the New Caledonian Crows, or the chewing on the stick that you see in chimpanzees, is very much in those cases the object itself is in front of you and presents features which might enable you to see you could stick it in that hole. All right. Whereas as we get into the later forms of the lithic technology, that kind of immediate perceptual recognition of what drives the next step is not going to be so apparent. And so the earliest Lameccrian and Aldebaran tool types, there might be repetitive knocking a flake off, but there's no repetitive knocking a flake off in order to obtain a certain shape on the core, which actually might require a more complex planning process. And we'll talk about that. Do animals recognize expertise after I've done this? So social transmission of various things among animals is well established, but I think it's not probative because seeing another animal do something can encourage you to go and play with it for yourself, and there's not necessarily any direct understanding that this individual is any good at that thing. There are some anecdotes from chimpanzees. So Kevin Hunt is another colleague of mine at Indiana, or ex-colleague of mine in Indiana, but he tells me about a couple of cases of the chimpanzees. One, a very bad hunting chimpanzee that always wants to hunt, is always going and trying to solicit the others to join. So chimpanzees will hunt small monkeys. They have to do it cooperatively because you can't catch a monkey on your own if you're a chimpanzee. It's like a dog trying to catch a squirrel. They're much faster than you are in the trees, and they can go in places you can't go because they can walk on branches that you can't hang on. So he suggests that this one individual recognizes that he's not very good at it, but he'll go and get the others who are better at it to go. It's just an anecdote, but it's interesting. Solicitation hunting, and then social signal copying. So there's a story actually from Jane Goodall, who Kevin also worked with, of Goblin, the chimpanzee, as a youngster, following Figgin, the alpha male, around, and then every time Figgin would do something like throw a log, Goblin would sort of wait a couple of seconds and then go and pick up the same log and throw it just the same. So there was this perhaps recognition of a kind of social expertise in that individual. A bit more in the lab. This is a fairly recent study from 2015 publication, where they looked at, given individuals in a chimpanzee colony who were trained on certain tasks, what kinds of imitation of the behavior do you see? And I'm going to just go through this really quickly, but basically what they find is that if a low-ranking individual sees a high-ranking individual doing something, they will tend to switch what they're doing. So this curve here shows basically the switching behavior. Whereas dominant animals watching a subordinate animal doing something different from what they're doing will stick with the strategy that they're using. So there's no real expertise here, but it's showing there's a kind of tracking of dominance going on. So if you think about expertise as correlated with with rank in some way, perhaps that gives the beginnings of something that could be elaborated into a more appropriate expertise tracking system. All right, what about neuropsychology? So Dwight Reed published a paper in 2008 where he tried to survey the literature and estimate what working memory capacity is for various fossil species, and then map it onto the kind of tools that you find associated with them. So these are the Australopithecines. Time is running this direction in this graph, which is unfortunate, especially since he put Pan chimpanzee out here, but actually that's the common ancestor, right? Modern Pan are over here. But then what he's suggesting is that working memory capacity is going up. Working memory capacity is going up linearly with encephalization quotient, and that's the ratio of brain to body, right, which a lot of people want to use. He argues that you get a second kink in this curve, right? I've already showed you the first kink, but he thinks there's a second kink there, which might account for the more complex forms that you find, particularly, and I'm not going to talk about these at stages 6 and 7, where you get much more fine-grained tool manufacture. Tom replotted the data and looked at this, and sure, that's the EQ, so it looks like there's sort of a kink in the curve right there. That's the one that that was being talked about. But when you plot against body weight, because modern Homo sapiens, these green dots, are smaller than the archaic Homo sapiens, our EQ goes up, but our brain size hasn't gone up, right? So we have to be really careful, again, using these sort of raw brain measures as indicative of anything. Why should the size of the body matter? Why should that ratio matter rather than the actual processing power? So I've got about 3 more slides. I think I'm good on time, right? So one thing to worry about that graph that I showed you with all those things is that maybe there's also a bias in our sampling. Maybe individuals of a certain age or a certain gender tend to be represented more disproportionately in the sample, and so we can't be entirely sure about that. And in fact, here's a very recent paper where they claim that the appearance of pulse change in hominin fossils is an artifact of uneven sampling. So they surveyed the whole set. And I, for that reason, tend to go back to that first graph I showed you where it just looks like a pretty straight linear development through time of cranial capacity at least, right? Also, this discussion of working memory, and I'm not going to go into this in much detail, but there are many different concepts of working memory, as I'm sure many of you in this room know, and oftentimes we're comparing apples with oranges. So many of you know or will have heard of these chimpanzees in the Matsuzawa's lab who can be shown a screen where there are numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, laid out on the screen. As soon as they touch the screen for the first one, they've been trained to touch them in ascending order. The mask comes up and all they see is those. They can still do this. Graduate students struggle with this task. Right? There's a more complicated story to tell. But you go, why is Reed saying that chimpanzees only have a working memory capacity of 2 when they can clearly do these 9 things and do it better than humans? Well, maybe we're talking about what's in a perceptual buffer rather than in working memory. And then there's this interesting distinction for short-term working memory that I'll come to in just a moment versus long-term working memory, the latter seemingly having something to do with expertise. But here's a review, the result of a review by Peter Carruthers that was in PNAS a few years ago, where he looked at all of the animal literature on working memory and basically also makes the point that there are many different notions, different things being compared here. There haven't been matching tests, but he says we can be confident that other primates have working memory systems homologous with our own. They seem to have pure retention abilities. His limits are similar to those of humans. Humans are by no means unique in having a capacity for prospection of future planning using working memory, but he says it seems likely that humans excel in the ability to withstand interference and deploy attention and rehearsal in flexible ways. And this is the key, I think, that also connects to the expertise point. but just to give him the last word on this slide, he says, until there's sustained effort by comparative psychologists to devise and carry out matching tests of working memory, this is all partly speculative. Now, the concept of long-term working memory goes back to Walter Kinch, this paper in 1905 by Erickson and Kinch, with the basic idea that you can, the basic idea of working memory, of course, goes back to Herb Simon and others, but the idea, and Rich Schifrin, I should mention, Atkinson and Schifrin, but the idea that you can sort of keep a few categories of objects, instances of categories of objects that you have in your conceptual scheme going in some sort of workspace becomes more elaborated once you can actually use chunks. You can chunk that information. So something that's in working memory can actually stand for a kind of configuration of things. That's the sort of Herbert Simon idea. What Erickson and Kinch claimed in this paper was that experts are robust to interruptions. So if you give an expert a working memory task in a domain in which they are experts, then they will easily get back to the prior state given an interruption, whereas novices have a lot more trouble reconstructing that. So they call this long-term working memory. As I said, it's this Gomez paper in 2000 is also sort of critical of this, saying that they're also not really comparing like with like in their areas. All right, so I'm running a little bit long, but give me 2 more minutes and I'll be done here. So Robert Mahaney, who also started with this project, sadly is no longer with us at all, looked at modern stone knappers replicating Aldewan or Acheulean technology in the scanner and found that there's of course a lot of visual and motor stuff going on, but the Acheulean, the more complex replication, overlaps with go-no-go cognitive control tasks. So that's interesting right there. He suggests that the Acheulean replication, this kind of tool here, presents stone knappers with conflicting choices, right? Because you're actually having to knock bits off on one side so you can turn it over and knock something off on the other side, and there's no straightforward way to do that. He also found that verbal working memory tasks overlap with fMRI in the Acheulean case, but not the Aldewan case. So there's this link somehow between language and tool making. He also did these protocol analyses where over the course of time, so that it might take 20 minutes for somebody to produce one of these things. Over the course of time, you get them to verbalize what they're doing. Red means they're talking about something that just happened. Green, short arrow, they're talking about something that's about to happen. Long green arrow means they're talking about something that's way off in the future, even right at the end of the process at certain points. So this task has a kind of natural hierarchical structure, which he explicitly in his dissertation compared to the Towers of Hanoi problem. So one of the questions that Todd has been pursuing is, can we actually look at experts in fMRI watching these tools getting made and see what's going on in terms of their processing of it and make some inferences then about the kinds of cognitive capacities required to make those tools early on. And there's a video attached to this which I will play once we get into the questions, because this is my last real slide. So the cognitive paleoethological framework, I hope to suggest, provides a set of heuristics for combining multiple kinds of evidence, and a comparative approach, combining comparative approach with the more traditional archaeological kind of data is potentially stronger than either alone. The feedback between expertise and recognition of expertise may be one factor helping to drive a great expansion in cultural niche for further specialized expertise. The evidence for expertise among extant animal species is there's not much of it, but perhaps it's because people haven't really been looking for it. So just like Carruthers says about the working memory tasks, people perhaps should be looking for this in the apes. But working memory is somehow related to expertise, tool making, possibly language, but variability in those concepts means that we're not really comparing like with like. So we need a combination of things, including more better analysis of the artifacts and fossils, and thinking of tool making as an embodied driver of this cognitive expansion, but just one drive among many. So that's my parting shot cartoon, the first expert. And while we're, I'm just going to start this video because this is Nick. What you're going to see after some text here is Nick Toth watching a video of himself from a point of view camera that had previously been recording making these tools, and a live fMRI stream that has been time shifted to try to calibrate it as closely as possible, given that we know the delay in the bulb response to what's going on. And this is just very preliminary data, but the idea is if you have Nick watching himself, he's watching an expert, he could be watching another expert, he could be watching a novice. A novice could be watching an expert, and so we can begin to tell to what extent areas that might be related to these kinds of hierarchical structural tasks, prefrontal, and Broca's area in particular, could be detected from this. And Tom's especially interested in Broca's area because he thinks from the interior endocasts of the fossilized crania, you can see differential expansion in that area in this hominin lineage. Right? So it's not just the brain as it's sort of inflating completely linearly in all directions, but you can see particular areas there. So I'll let that run, and you can watch it in the background while you ask me questions. So thanks. Good. Or you can just watch it. Yeah, question.
So, with regards to the development of these different styles of tool making, it sounds like, or it looked like, that these different techniques developed in physical places. Is there any evidence of innovation of tool making within the human community? So, if you follow the record, you can
so it's really hard to answer that question, but we know that in the Olduvai Gorge, you have the full spectrum, right up to modern, completely anatomically modern Homo sapiens making stone tools. It's part of the issue is dating these things, but from the stratigraphy, you can tell when the layers are laid down. You sort of know roughly when each one was done, and so it's of course possible that some population died out and some other population moved back in. There's certainly climatic change going on at this time scale. We know there's a big lake there. There's so much I couldn't tell you in this short talk. There's a lake there which shrinks and expands over time. Interestingly, when it's expanded, they can't access a particular favorite source of raw material. But when it's contracted, they are going and getting that raw material. So we know, in fact, they're going to this rocky outcropping and picking up large chunks of rock, partly working it at the quarry site, if you like, and carrying it then down to where they're butchering the animals. So they're transporting big chunks of rock over distances on the order of 5 kilometers, right? There's a lot of continuity in that record that lets you say, yes, despite these disruptions, as soon as the climate sort of changes again and the lake is shrunk again, they're back doing that behavior they were doing before. So again, this particular site in the Olduvai is not where they're living, right? It's where they're doing the butchery and the tool making. So if we had better evidence of where they're living, which is probably up on the slopes of a volcano that would have been active at that time as well, then we might be able to answer the question about what the real continuity of the population is. Once you get out of Africa, then it's even harder to piece together exactly what the relationship is between those different sites. One theory is that they're following prey species that are not, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not scared by hominids anymore, right? Yet, because they're not used to these little hominids as predators. So they may be chasing easy prey. And if you do the numbers, if you assume it's a couple 100,000 years to get from East Africa to China, they're moving on the order of sort of a day's walk per generation or so. So it's not that fast a radiation.
And that sounds like an account for the biological side of this tool human system or tool animal system. With regards to tool designs themselves, are you seeing a lot of innovation within a given spot, or is this do you require moving out of your old home, so to speak, in order?
Yeah, no, actually, so good. That helps me make another point, which is the tools we find contemporaneous with the Olduvai Acheulean tools in China or Georgia are actually much cruder than what they're doing back in the Olduvai. Now, it could be, and this is another confounding factor, it could be that the raw material they have access to in those other places doesn't allow such fine working. And certainly at Olduvai, they've got a choice of volcanic material, which they do use, or this granite that I mentioned that they go some distance to transport. Whereas mostly you find much less suitable raw materials for fine working in these other places. Now, there are lots of potential explanations for this, and I don't think we have a good answer to sort it all out. But one is, maybe if this easy prey hypothesis is right, you don't need such good tools, so why waste your time making them, right? You might also think that back in the Olduvai, one of the things that's happening is it's drying out, and you're also competing with other predators that they're getting more and more desperate. So maybe you have to become more efficient at getting the food out of whatever it is that you're butchering. So there might be a pressure there that would lead in that local site to this kind of tool elaboration. But yeah, no, those are great questions. I don't have great answers for. Yeah.
So there's some skills that are highly specialized for humans, like sensory motor timing. There's actually only 2 animals, I think, that I know, snowball, the cockatoo, and the sea lion that can be trained to be offshore with them. So do you think that animals can watch, snowball or the sea lion and train to the beat of the rhythm and recognize that as an expert skill? Or?
It's an interesting question. I think anecdotally, Nick and Kathy say that when they were teaching both Kanzi and Panbanisha, who's Kanzi's sister, to make these tools. First, Kanzi was taught first, and he was extremely jealous of this, so he would actually try to interrupt Panbanisha, that sort of suggests some understanding of I've got a skill and you don't have it, but it's anecdotal. The other data point there is that they. When you are hitting, so the way they solved that problem is they would put Panbanisha in a different room, right, so the Kanzi couldn't interfere. But when you've got something, so if you watch that video, you see he hits it a couple of times before he gets a flake off. There's a distinctive sound that if you're experienced, is like what happens just before you're going to get a flake off. And they say that Kanzi would recognize that sound and try to get into the other room when he heard that coming from Panbanisha. So it's possible that there's something auditory going on. Entrainment to rhythm, I think that's also really interesting, because a lot of this ends up, particularly in the later stages, being a very rhythmic activity. And I think what you're seeing Kanzi doing is not super rhythmic in style. There are lots of animals that do these sort of synchronized mating dances, so they can entrain to rhythms. I think that's why the cockatoo is so good, for instance, right? So I think the general ability to entrain to rhythm is probably quite widespread. But seeing that as a marker of another capacity, we've just got those anecdotes about Kanzi. Yeah.
So also in reference to the recognition of expertise thing, your example with the chimp made me think that you might be able to, it looks like an expertise network with just other heuristics, like recognizing that you yourself are bad at something and seeking help and getting help only from others who recognize that they're good at it. So just kind of open-ended thought.
Yeah, no, it's a great thought, and it's also allows me to say something more about the multifactorial nature of this. So So there are chimpanzees in West Africa that use two rocks, one as an anvil and one as a hammer to open nuts. And it's a hard skill to acquire, so they actually don't become fully competent at it until 6 or 7 years of age. Mostly only the females have the patience to do this. The males are, attention deficit, whatever. And people who work with the chimpanzees say that the males are much more cued into who's fighting with whom and sort of all this dominant stuff going on. So as soon as they hear some, competitive interaction going on in the forest, they bolt it. But the other thing is that really it's pretty much without exception that these young chimpanzees that are acquiring this skill only acquire it from their own mothers, because there's not a lot of tolerance by chimpanzees of having even members of your own group in close proximity unless you're engaging in a sort of ritualized play type interaction or grooming interaction, which has all its own signaling around it. So for whatever reason, there's lack of willingness to tolerate other young chimpanzees around you while you're doing this. And part of Sterelny's story is that the cooperative aspects of early hominin behavior actually requires, for reasons that I hinted at, leaving the kids at home. And that means alloparenting, because you leave some of the adults back to make sure they're not getting into too much trouble or wandering off, right? And that increases the willingness to tolerate the proximity of non-kin or non-immediate kin, not immediate offspring. And that sets up then also a potential for this kind of apprenticeship learning. So even if a chimpanzee could recognize that you're the person to learn this skill from, and not Carolyn, right? Then it's not the case in chimpanzees that I'd be free to go, right, watch you rather than her. So you've got all of these things going on: the cooperative scavenging, hunting, the need therefore to sort of put non-immediate family members together, feeding into a system where this differential skill can lead to then the spread of those skills differentially through the population as well.
There aren't any more students who have questions, and anyone you can ask a question. Back.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the Broca's data. So do they? I was trying to watch the fMRI pattern as you were playing that, but what exactly are they seeing? I mean, it seems like if that's the hypothesis, you should see humans have some activation in that domain when they're doing that.
Yeah, so that's right. So this video was just put up a couple of weeks ago, and they haven't actually done the data analysis. It's just a demo of what they're collecting. I can squint at it and tell you a story. One of the things that I did, let me just pause that briefly and see if I can bring back up my slide here. So when I had this slide up, right? So this is Nick actually, he's looking at the core here, and preparation of this required, because he knows he's got to remove a big chunk on one side, but he's going to have to knock off some smaller pieces on the other side. So this also requires like fine motor control, right? You can't just whack it as hard as you can, because you'll not achieve the result. So he's looking at this, trying to figure out what to do next. And then here he's just separated a flake. You might be able to see it here. So that's after a hit. He's using a different tool at this stage of the video. You can clearly see different patterns of activation, right? Can you tie it specifically to Broca's area? Well, there's definitely different pattern here and here, but I think I can't tell from that picture is the answer. But there are differences going on that may tie to this, and that's still to be determined. Yeah.
So the primary data are the interior of the skulls they're finding changing.
So in the hominin fossil case, that's right. They're trying to look at interiors of the skulls, but in many cases, those nice skulls that you see in magazines are actually models that are reconstructed from fragments. So you have a few fragments and then you sort of infer what the rest ought to have looked like. I skipped over this because I had way too much information, but the Dmanisi case is really fabulous because there they have 5 nearly intact skulls from 1.8 million years ago. Very interestingly, one of them is clearly an old individual who has completely lost teeth, and so much so that the jawbone is being reabsorbed as well, right? So this individual somehow managed to be kept alive for a very long time, right? So that's some evidence of this kind of intense social cooperativity going on. And there are actually 5 dots here, but these 2 are right on top of each other. So those blue diamonds are the 5 skulls that they have at Dmanisi, so you can see what range they're in. It's a very rare ability to get inside those and see whether or not you could look at what the state of particular areas such as Broca's area are. So there appears, though, with what data has been able to get, so in a lot of cases you have just like a little piece of the top of the cranium, so you're inferring the whole thing from that, right? But in some cases you have something more intact. So what he's been able to glean is that there is differential expansion going on in this area, and it's not bilateral, right? So there seems to be particular. But now we've got all the usual problems of where is language actually located, and, right? So it's.
That was my next question.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. So yeah, if you want to push that a bit harder, ask the question. But.
I wanted to mention that a friend of mine who's now in the UK at University of East Anglia they just published a paper, he and colleagues that are from a completely different department using the technology I use, NIRS, looking at stone tool production, and it was in Science Advances or something. It's one of those sub-science magazines. And I thought, what the hell is this? And now I get it.
You see the picture, the picture. Yeah, good. Right.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so this sort of cognitive neuroarchaeology is sort of is a thing now. In fact, Dietrich Stout was the first person to do any kind of brain scanning on modern flint knappers, and he was one of Nick and Kathy's students 20 years ago. So they've very much been pushing that line for a couple of decades now. Now lots of people all over the place are doing similar things. Yeah.
The data on imitating dominant animals
Yeah.
raises the question of how tightly coupled evidence of specialization is with actual differences in skill and expertise.
Yep.
You could easily imagine that an animal comes to play a particular role out of habit, but anyone could have played that role initially.
That's right.
So what evidence is there at these timescales that there really is a recognition of expertise rather than just some amount of specialization?
Yeah. So again, I think there we're mostly thrown back on trying to do comparative psychology and looking at what's going on in modern apes, which are rather poor proxies after all, for various reasons. So there's certainly with respect to that individual who I told you about that's always soliciting others to try to go hunting, there's certainly the case that when the others go hunting, it slips into a role which is not very crucial to the success of the hunt, shall we say. So and that's partly, I think, why Kevin says this is an individual who's not very good at hunting. The others actually are very reluctant they've been, they find it very annoying. This is again, Kevin's field observations. Find this individuals constantly trying to get them to go hunting sort of annoying, and only when they hear a monkey that they think is catchable, because you hear the monkeys around all the time, but then apparently, under certain conditions, they'll all sort of perk up and then start moving very, very quietly, right? So, and dead silence and all the rest of it. So this one individual is sort of allowed to go along on these and plays maybe a kind of role where you want to cut off certain lines of escape for the monkey, but you're not the one going to be actually catching it. So that, again, is purely anecdotal. I don't think we have really good systematic evidence of that. A lot of people have tried to do role understanding and role switching in the comparative psychology labs. Part of the problem with that research program for these purposes, I'm not saying it's a problem with the program itself, is that people are approaching that with kind of theory of mind questions, which is, if I have been trained to do this task in this part of a two individual task, and I've watched the other ones, now I'm forced into this position, can I just do it because I understand the task structure well enough to make that switch? And that's a really different kind of question than, do I recognize that this individual might be better at that part and I'm better at this part? And by the way, that particular individual has been trained multiple times on this side, but not on that side. So you might understand why that individual might not put in the best performance on that side, right? So designing an experiment that would really get at this difference between taking a role, understanding a role, and being good at the role, is, I think, really tricky, but not impossible. It's just that there's only so many primate labs, especially chimpanzee labs in the world, and not enough people doing them, doing these kinds of experiments.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
So I was just going to ask a question trying to bring together this idea of imitation and language acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering if what you see is evidence for Broca's area, or if it's just part of a more generic action observation network, in which areas very close to the Broca's area, like the ventral premotor cortex, are involved.
Yeah. So we know right from even the original mirror neuron discussions that that's an important kind of function going on there. I think that the answer to that is going to depend a lot on the data that Todd is collecting from this last experiment that I showed you. But I presume those areas can be teased apart. And in this case too, so the instructions to the subject in the scanner are, imagine yourself doing this task, right? So imagine what you're watching is yourself doing it as well. So there might be some engagement of premotor because of that instruction.
That makes sense, but there isn't much by way of sort of grammaticality in the task in terms of like serial order or something like that, which would recruit something like the Broca's.
Oh, well, so actually that's what I was trying to get at with this slide here, where there is a kind of structure to the task where, although I perhaps was rather rushing at a point, where these sort of very short-term actions might be just sort of lightly tapping something preparatory to making a big blow that's going to knock a big chunk off, such as the one that was in the right-hand side of the last video I showed you, right? So you have to do a lot of chipping away on one side so that when you turn it over and knock at that particular point, that piece is going to come off cleanly rather than fracturing the whole thing, right? So there's at least a kind of structure here and sequencing in that you can't go straight to that big blow. You've got to do this preparatory work in order to get there. So there's different. So actually, this is sort of talking about the final end state. This is talking about some rather like 2/3 way kind of state, right? But here we're talking about something that's going to be executed here. So there's a series of small steps in between that are also being talked about as getting us closer to this goal down here, right? And that's what gives it the kind of structure that makes Tom think that the Broca's area might be involved. Simultaneously, he's also doing experiments with orangutans at the Indianapolis Zoo, looking at the kinds of capacity they have to pick up on finite state grammars, using faces as the tokens in the strings. And then he's going to do he's doing exactly that with human subjects, and we'll be trying to see what kinds of brain areas are active during the, ostensibly the same task being given to the orangutans and the humans. Why orangutans? Because that's what they've got at the zoo that's available, right? So again, it's not ideal, but Rob Schumacher, who's the director of the research at the zoo there, has always worked with orangutans and brought ones that were originally at the National Zoo to Indianapolis, so they're convenient. So the idea is that these are structured tasks, and they involve a kind of hierarchically structured sequential steps. So they're, each of these chunks is sort of a repetition of this. Okay, now I'm going to take this big chunk off, but first I got to get all these little bits off, and that element repeats within the system. And we don't want to say, he doesn't want to say, he shouldn't want to say that it's true recursion or anything like that, but it's got this more complex structure than making an all-in-one tool, which is sort of, okay, knock something off this side, knock something off that side, got a sharp edge, great, chop with it, right? It's the complexity of that is much, much less, yeah.
So I had a question / comment that really relates to what you're just saying. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the role of kind of mental imagery in making tools. So the idea that you start out with a big chunk of rock and have to kind of visualize like how the end product is going to be.
Yeah.
And as the tools got kind of smaller over time, with increased hand and wrist dexterity, it seems like there's more cuts to be made to make it into that shape. And
Yeah.
so at that same time, I would think that would require mental imagery over a longer time scale
That's
and simply because you have more cuts needed, you have to really think at a longer time scale about how you're going to create this tool. And I'm wondering, maybe this kind of longer time period of mental imagery that's needed also coincides or causes the increase that some people are proposing in terms of longer term working memory.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and I, again, don't know that I have a satisfactory answer to it. I mean, we know, we think we know that, for instance, in the transportation of raw materials, there is a kind of planning process which is taking place over hours, and chimpanzees also do this. In fact, there's anecdotal evidence of chimpanzees engaging in planning processes that span days, weeks, and even months, right? So there's a the time scales can be quite long, but I think what's interesting about the stone tool is it's all actually rather relatively short. It's not like, okay, first I got to go get the raw materials and then I've got to go, right? It's like I'm looking at this thing, I've got some idea of what I want to get out of it. I can see that I'm going to have to remove this big blob here, but before I can do that cleanly, I'm going to have to take off these other protrusions here. And so the time course is on the order. I mean, I didn't spell this out either, but that's about 20 minutes there, right? So it's over a fairly extended time course, but still a lot less than planning your whole day out. So I think it would be really interesting to see whether the long-term working memory results could be specific, or the experiments could be specifically done within that kind of time range. Because typically, the kinds of things that were done originally by like Erickson and Kinch are sort of the obvious things where you show an expert a board position on a chessboard, right, and then sort of distract them with something and get them to recreate it. And those aren't even 20-minute tasks, they're much shorter tasks. So really figuring out the dynamics of this, I think, would be a great way to go.
But I think the difference between carving a tool and the perspective planning that's needed to do that versus the perspective planning that's needed to think about like storing food for the winter. In this case, you have to sustain your attention like for 20 minutes straight, right?
Yes.
Whereas in the other case, you can think about it, okay, I got some nuts, I'm gonna go bury them. Okay, I'm off to the next thing.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the driving.
Yeah, no, and I see why, given your talk today, why sustained attention would be of definite interest here, and that's great. So there is a kind of sustained attention, and I guess the suggestion from Kinch and others is that experts are going to be more robust if you disrupt that attention. They'll get back to the task more quickly, which, by the way, I think I forgot to say is an advantage if you've got learners around, because they're going to be interrupting you all the time, and if you kind of lose track of what you're doing, in that case, that's not going to help either. So yes, it does require sustained attention, but with expertise, it's also robust to setting it aside and coming back to it maybe even a day later, and oh yeah, that's what I was going to do, right? You very quickly recall from your longer term memory what the state of the game was, right, when you do that. So I think, again, we just don't know enough about the dynamics of memory over those kinds of timescales in these kinds of tasks, mostly because most psychologists don't want to do experiments that recall bringing subjects back in over those kinds of timescales, or keeping them around for that too. So absolutely, those are great questions. And it does seem, though, I think what you're getting at is really the distinction. I went over this deliberately quickly when I first put up the read slide here. It's going to freeze on me. Okay. So he argues that this is simply repetitive task. This is an iterative task because in order to get a chopper, you have to. So you repetitively take off flakes. If you knock once, you got a flake. You knock once, you got a flake. It's repetitive, but it's not iterative. This is iterative because you might have to knock a few times, but it's basically the same action to get something that will suffice. You're not aiming, you're not visualizing, to use your language before, any particular outcome other than something that when you see it, you'll know you've got it, right? Here, though, he calls this also iterative because he thinks that you can get to this without having a very clear idea of what you've got in mind, right? But you can get there by sort of doing something, looking at what you've got, doing some more of that thing, right? Looking at what you've got. So there's a little bit of a loop here, but it's nowhere near as complicated as what comes up later. So by the time we get to the Levallois flaking technology, which is only 300,000 years ago, he thinks that you've got something that actually properly described as algorithmic. And there, what he has in mind is that producing this tool actually requires using different tools to do it. So in the two images I had from the stills from the video, I said, oh, he's actually using a different tool there. Turns out much later they start using reindeer antlers and things to really trim up the edge and make it look pretty. And a lot of what's going on there too is they're now making, in some cases, giant hand axes, which are probably not even functional. They're just making them because they look great, So they're like showing off their expertise in a way, right, by producing these very finely produced things. And again, I didn't dwell on that because it was much later in the period we're looking at here. And then at the end, where you get to arrowheads and all of these very specific shapes, that's known as prismatic blade production, and you don't start seeing that until about 50,000 years ago, really fully modern Homo sapiens. But he claims that this is actually requires a recursive process. And it's a three-dimensional task, and that you have to keep that many things going at the same time in order to accomplish it, right? So much more demanding, he claims, on memory. But to go back to sort of language, I mean, we've all been indoctrinated by Chomsky into thinking that it's not language if it's not recursive. But there could be plenty of simpler kinds of communication schemes that would co-evolve with this kind of, from repetitive to iterative to maybe algorithmic kinds of processes. So I think that's part of the story here that needs to be understood. Is it's not going to be a sudden jump with no language to language. It's going to be ability to communicate in ways that follow in some ways the structure of the kinds of manual tasks. Well, that was the previous slide, but the kinds of structure of the manual tasks where you could say, I'm going to do this, now I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do this, now I'm going to do that. Not recursive, right, but serial in an important way. So, yeah, good. Yeah.
I'm just curious, when do you first start seeing like categories emerge in the tools that you so like maybe like the later ones you have arrowheads and you have knives and you have spearheads or whatever,
right?
And if you start to see the categories, then you would know that people are creating these particular tools with some goal before they start, right? They're making a thing in particular.
Right.
I'm wondering at what time scale do you start seeing those kinds of categories?
Well, arguably you even see that in the older ones. So if we go back to the older one picture, it's this one, right? I suggested that these are just byproducts of manufacturing, although they might also be used. They're actually a perfect size for throwing, right? That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So they might have been used once they were sort of done with in that way. That's controversial. But you're seeing flakes like this, which can be used to cut, or you're seeing choppers like this, which are sort of being shaped to a point. So you've got a pick. That's called a pick. You've got more like choppers that have got a longer edge, not a sharp point. Those are good for slicing or hacking into joints, right? So the picks probably were good for getting into bone marrow again. So you're like banging on an elephant bone to break it open so you can get to the marrow. And part of this, Jackson Zhao, I mentioned, part of his is trying to distinguish those kinds of marks from crocodile marks again. So crocodiles, when they grip down on a bone, exert a lot of very forceful pressure. They tend to leave a flat indentation in the bone, whereas this leaves a more jagged indentation in the bone. And so he's actually, part of his research is giving animal parts to crocodiles and examining the marks of it's exciting work, let me tell you. Right? So we can compare what happens experimentally to what we're seeing in the fossil record. But yeah, so I would say even at this point, you're seeing functional specialization in the toolkit, right? You'd be silly to try to break open a bone with a flake like that. It's not going to happen, right? And you'd be equally silly to try to cut a limb off, because one suggestion is they're also cutting off limbs or feet in the case of elephants and carrying that away, because it's very dangerous where they're doing this, right? So they're like hacking off as much as they can, as quickly as they can, and getting out of there. So they're probably cutting off big parts, getting in the marrow, nice immediate snack, right? Gives you lots of energy, because you've just expended a lot working to break this thing open. Yeah, different tools for different purposes. There, but the flake for skinning, right? You've got to get the skin off the thing before you get to the meat. So that already there, 3 million years ago, we've got that kind of 2.5, that kind of specialization.
Thank you.
Good.
All right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.